are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest is somebody I've been reading and listening to for a very long time. He's said a lot of great things over the years about foreign policy, and he wrote something recently that I didn't agree with, or I agreed with parts of it, I should say. And my reaction to that was, rather than do what we on the left do far too often, since he is a fellow progressive, too often we take to YouTube or print or some other media to attack one another. And I just thought, why don't we talk instead and see, if we can come to some kind of at least understanding. And he was kind enough to agree to do that with me. Matt Duss is the foreign policy advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders. So we have Bernie experience as a shared part of our lives. And believe me, it is part of your life. And even though he's not feeling all that great today, he was kind enough to join us. And I should say before we begin that although he works for Senator Sanders, as is always the case in situations like this, I'm going to assume he's speaking for himself, and we'll take that accordingly. Matt Duss, first of all, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you. And as you know from our emails, I wanted to talk to you about a piece you wrote in the New Republic. Excuse me, I'm going to put my glasses on. It's not a distancing effort emotionally or anything. Why Ukraine matters for the left is at least the headline that the New Republic gave it, with the subheadline, "Opposition to U.S. adventurism is principled, but this is Putin's adventurism and the left must stand firmly against it." I had some thoughts about it, and I guess a place to start would be this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. One of my concerns, there is a debate, as you rightly note in this piece, going on in the left between those who largely support the Biden administration's approach to Russia's war crime in the Ukraine. Let's not mince words. That's what it is, a series of war crimes. And between those who think that the Biden administration is not sufficiently taking history and context and not sufficiently emphasizing negotiations. But it seems to me one of my concerns, Matt, is that this conversation has gotten super polarized. And I see this in my own discussions where it's either, if you support what the administration is doing, you're a sellout. If you want the administration to behave differently as I do, you don't say this, but people, you're a Putin apologist. You don't recognize Ukraine's rights and so on. And do you agree with me that this conversation on the left has gotten too polarized?
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I really appreciate the way that you set up our conversation today. Which is that, too often I think the first reaction from various, throughout our political discourse, but, within the left, which is what I'm really interested in here and with this piece is, as you said, often the first reaction is to simply attack. And part of my goal here with this piece was to foster, a constructive, good faith discussion and debate around what I think is a pretty important issue, a pivotal issue, I think, in terms of how we're thinking about how, the world and global issues. I think a lot of implications and potential consequences for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I recognize that colleagues and friends of mine on the left have a very different view, and I respect that. And I wanted to just kind of set up what I see as some of those disagreements and represent them in the most charitable way I could and truthful way that I could, and explain why I disagree and explain what my position is and how I think it reflects a kind of set of progressive values.
Yeah, okay. And let's go through that a little bit, because as I said in the introduction, I did have points of, a lot of points of disagreement, but not 100%. And I think that's part of what I like to get into is that X doesn't mean not Y. But you begin, I thought this was an interesting authorial choice on your part, Matt, to begin with Christopher Hitchens' piece in The Atlantic after 9/11, which a lot of us remember as being not only wrong, but epically wrong. And you note that he was epically wrong. But as you just say, 20 years have kind of shown that. And then you point out that one of his targets was Susan Sontag, the great writer and philosopher, who had dared to suggest, I'm quoting you, that the attacks were partly a consequence of U.S. policies. Let us by all means grieve together, Sontag wrote, but let us not be stupid together. A few shreds of historical awareness might help us understand what has just happened and what may continue to happen. I actually thought, that sentence of Susan Sontag's for me is a perfect description of how we should be reacting now. You don't address that either way, but do you agree? I know you strongly agree with her in that context of 9/11. Do you agree with that in the context of the invasion of Ukraine?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think as we think about what the correct U.S. policy response is, we have to understand. And again, this is something that Senator Sanders has both written and spoken about. I have in other contexts. The conversation about the expansion of NATO is an entirely valid one. I think, as I wrote in the piece, and I've written and said elsewhere, there's a lot of evidence from U.S. officials, both former and current U.S. officials, who've talked about how politically problematic NATO expansion was for the Russian government and for the Russian political systems. I would also mention some other things that I didn't really mention in the piece, but I have talked about in other places, which let's go even further back and understand the role that the kind of, neoliberal shock therapy that was essentially imposed on, Russia the post-Soviet Russia, the role that played in the creation of this new elite oligarch class, and in turn to the rise of Vladimir Putin, who the oligarchs initially kind of accepted as someone who thought they could control, but ended up, turning the tables and essentially controlling them. So yes, there's a whole set of things we need to understand historically. That's not to say it's all the U.S.'s fault, but the United States and our European allies did play a role and contributed to this situation in a serious way. We absolutely have to acknowledge that.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that. Matt, I was an advisor to the State Department during the time of the fall of communism, and in the health sector mostly, but I was reassigned immediately to the Soviet sphere as one after another countries. And so I saw that happen. And I remember vividly, it's not just history for me, that we we could second guess the decision now or not, but that we put Boris Yeltsin in power, defended him from a military coup. And of course, it was Yeltsin who handpicked Putin. So, hindsight's 2020. So I'm not trying to relitigate that, but I'm so glad that you mentioned the historical context. But here's a line from your piece that you're quoting Hitchens again, who was, by the way, just parenthetically, he seemed great when you agreed with him, and he was like monumentally annoying when you disagreed with him. But you write, quoting Hitchens, all the left's objections, Hitchens wrote, quote, boil down to this is Hitchens' words: nothing will make us fight against an evil if that fight forces us to go to the same corner as our own government, end quote. Now, I got to tell you, Matt, I hear this constantly in discussions with fellow progressives about Ukraine. I've had, we live on email lists on the left, and I've had email list conversations where I will say over and over, no, I think there is a role for our government. No, it's not that I always want to be on the other side of my government. I'm sure there are some people on, quote unquote, my side of this debate who are like that, but no, that's not what I'm saying at all. And then the next reply will be, well, but you always want to be against our government. This has become like, I'm sure you can name like reflexive reactions you get. This is one I get all the time, and I have to say, no, that's not me, and I think it's not a lot of people who have concerns about our strategy. In other words, and then I'll give it back to you, but I don't think it's binary. I think it's possible. I mean, I think you and I are points on a spectrum. We're not, the switch on or the switch off. I think it's possible to say there is a role for our government in this, but it needs to be significantly different from the one we're taking. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And again, I think the way you set it up is one I agree with. And, I mentioned that line from Hitchens, just as one that kind of was ringing in my head. And I do acknowledge, in the next paragraph that's a hyperbolic and unfair statement from Hitchens.
Right.
But I would nonetheless like to make sure it remains that way. I mean, I do think there are people, not a lot. I certainly would not characterize a large constituency of the left in this way, but there are people who do seem reflexively just to oppose whatever the U.S. does. But I do think there are, again, people who have very good faith differences of views, who believe that the U.S. has a role to play in ending this conflict, but disagree with the way the Biden administration is going about it. And I totally agree. It is not productive to just say, well, you're either with, what Biden is doing or not. I think there's a much more diverse shade of opinion within that space. And we should recognize that. So again, what I was trying to draw out with this piece was just, where I stand with regard to some of the questions, the very fair and legitimate questions I think that, leftists that I respect have raised about this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, we're talking with Matt Duss about Ukraine. And by the way, parenthetically, I had one parent born in France, two grandparents born in what is now Ukraine. I can't get French citizenship because my mother didn't fill out the papers. I can get Ukrainian citizenship. So, maybe that's an option at some point. You also write, we should not let all of this absurdity, while you accurately describe some of the absurdity of this situation, blind us to the instances where provision of military aid can advance a more just and humanitarian global order. Assisting Ukraine's defense against Russian invasion is such an instance. Well, here, in my reaction to this, I may actually distance myself from a few of my allies in the struggle to shift the administration. Mm-hmm. I actually think a certain amount of arms support to the Ukrainians is absolutely justified, that they have a right to fight an invading power that is just as colonialist and imperialistic as we have been in the Middle East. I think that's not a question for me personally. But here's a thought. Perhaps the United States, given its history of invasions, of militarism, of political servitude in Washington to the so-called defense industry and so on, perhaps we're not the ideal people to be leading that effort. What I would envision is something more multilateral, that where, unfortunately we dominate the United Nations too, as does Russia, but where some multinational organization might take the lead. If you look, for example, at the hostility to any aid to Ukraine and that's prevalent in the Southern Hemisphere, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the U.S. is leading it. And my ideal scenario is one where it's not led by the U.S., but it's an international effort, which would make it more palatable worldwide and maybe lessen the tendency of our aid to Ukraine to strengthen the military industrial complex. That's a lot to pack into one thing, yeah. But do you get what I'm driving at?
No, I do. And I think there are a couple, more than a couple, but a couple very good points in there I just want to respond to. One is, my point about the absurdity of the kind of double standard and hypocrisy that exists with regard to Washington. I mentioned, people, hearing U.S. officials and U.S. politicians, condemning Putin's, and Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, which is right. I mean, what Russia has been doing in Ukraine is absolutely horrifying. But at the same time, we had this, for example, this kind of gaffe by former President George W. Bush when he was trying to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and slipped and referred to one man's decision to destroy Iraq, or whatever he said. And it's just a reminder that we have a whole set of officials who are responsible for decisions that have resulted in enormous destruction and suffering and displacement and death, that have simply faced no meaningful accountability. I think we have to recognize that, but at the same time, that in itself is not an argument for not helping here if we can. I think your second point about, ideally, it would be a multilateral organization or some kind of coalition assisting here. And I would agree, ideally, yes. Ideally, I think we would have an actually functioning UN. We would have an actually functioning set of multilateral organizations that could kind of develop consensus and legitimacy for a response in this case. Unfortunately, we don't have that now. I mean, that's a much longer conversation of why, the system is basically falling apart as it is now. And we've played a role in that. I mean, again, as I've noted, I think in the piece, but elsewhere, and I noted this in a foreign affairs piece I wrote a couple months ago, the United States, under the auspices of the war on terror, particularly the invasion of Iraq, did as much as any country to undermine, the so-called international rules-based order.
Right, exactly.
And we have to acknowledge that. Now, having said that, I mean, we are in the situation we're in, and, all things considered, I do think that the Biden administration has actually been working pretty aggressively and assiduously with European partners and pushing them to play much more of a leading role. I think what we saw over, the days and weeks immediately after the Russian invasion, with Germany shifting, its historic defense policy and supplying aid and support to Ukrainians at a much higher level. It's going to take some time, but I do think part of what I appreciate about the Biden administration's policy is precisely that it is trying to get the Europeans to play a larger role for what is in fact a war in Europe.
And I think that's right, Matt. And I would agree with that. But I think that is largely limited to Western developed nations. And one of my concerns about all of this is the sanctions against Russia people keep telling me, experts keep telling me, could cause massive food crises. And the people who will bear the brunt of that in terms of starvation or shortage are in developing nations. And I feel as if they don't have a say in decisions that are being made that could affect effectively cost their lives. And I wonder what you think about that, because I'm very concerned about it.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely right. And again, this point that you're making, people in the global South and the less powerful countries, essentially being the subjects of decisions that are made far away from them. This is a much bigger problem than just here, but we see it brought to the surface here. For all the reasons you just said, because of the grain shortage, on top of the pandemic, on top of climate change, and all the conflicts and tensions that gives rise to. I think that is a huge problem, and giving these countries in the global South much more of a voice and much more of a place at the table in global governance, I think is a huge and important project that the United States needs to be invested in. And I certainly understand, I mean, the point that you've made, and I've made it as well, like we should not pretend that, we have global unity on our side with what the United States and Europe are doing in Ukraine, because it's, we talk about the West, it's not even the West, it's basically the Northwest of the globe that is involved here. Right. And we need to understand why that is. I mean, a lot of these countries have, some of them do have just basic their own version of realpolitik and the relationship they have with Russia and with China and
right, of course,
actors like that. But also, they are suffering from an already existing food crisis, which, frankly, is being made worse just because of a war. And also because, Putin is quite clearly holding this food and this grain and these supplies hostage as part of trying to put pressure on the rest of the world.
And no, I think that's right. But I think, my ideal, I think these countries should also be concerned about creating a better world order that would discourage invasion of their countries.
Yeah.
And the ideal management, it may sound like John and Yoko singing Imagine, but the ideal management of a crisis like this is one that, I hear a lot of rhetoric about fortifying a rules-based world order by doing this, but I see nothing in the way it's currently being managed that would, for example, restrain the United States from its next invasion.
Yeah.
So it seems to me more, the people who say this is part of a process of reviving kind of Cold War tensions, to me, they have a point, because we're not saying, well, look, we're targeting Russia. And then while in the meantime, other policies are targeting China. And I'm not saying we shouldn't compete with these countries, but, economically and diplomatically and so on, where that's appropriate. But it seems to me, I wouldn't come away from this if I were in a developing Southern Hemisphere country thinking, well, I should support this, because then if somebody comes after me, there'll be a world order that protects me.
Yeah. No, I think what you're getting at, and this is part of what I was trying to suss out in the piece, maybe I succeeded, maybe I didn't, but is the idea that, can we, and I think we can, and others may disagree, you may disagree, can we support, what we are doing to help Ukraine defend itself in this case, while at the same time continuing to work to transform a global system which is corrupt and ineffective and facilitates repression of the majority of humankind? Or as I think some critics of the piece and those who disagree with you might say, by supporting, U.S. policy with Ukraine right now, we are only affirming those worst aspects. And I think that is kind of an area where I see some of the main disagreement being.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's spot on. And I think that, there's a lot of room for discussion there. Discussions I don't think we're having among ourselves. That's one of the reasons why I'm glad we're talking. For example, Congress voted $40 billion in aid to Ukraine. Every progressive voted for it. Barbara Lee voted for it. But it strikes me, without, critiquing or not critiquing the specific number, it strikes me that a progressive position on this would be to say, okay, even if we agree that the right number is 40 billion, and we could talk about that, but if we do, we need oversight, we need transparency. We need to know why, given the mass destruction we're seeing on television and in reports of the infrastructure as well as lives in Ukraine, we need to know why more than half of it is military, less than half of it is humanitarian or infrastructure. We need reports on how it's being. You get what I'm driving at, that the transparency and oversight of it.
Right.
Piece of it, I don't see the left calling for that in Washington.
Yeah. I think that's a fair point. I do think, a number of folks have raised these questions. There needs to be more. I think, we've also seen voices not only on the left, but also on the right, recognizing, I think, the justness of supporting, Ukraine's defense, but also making clear that, the United States and its European allies are going to need to step up and at some point very soon to look for some options out of this. I think Ross Douthat's piece in the New York Times, for example, was pretty good. I don't agree with all of it, but I do think he raised some really important points, not only with regard to the cost, because, when you look at our massive defense budget, the amount, whatever it is, 50 or 60 billion total that we've given to Ukraine is not all that much. But again, our defense budget is just like ridiculously too big anyway. But yeah, I think those are all very legitimate concerns. And I think we need more voices pressing the administration on it. And I think we'll see that. But I think, the purpose of my piece, again, I think was to kind of think through, is there a place to support, military force, even if we are not the ones using force. We are supporting the Ukrainians' use of force in defense of their country. And, what is the correct progressive response to that?
Right. No, I think that's a legitimate topic of discussion for sure. Now, Matt Duss, here's a sentence in your piece that I do strongly. I disagree with it, but let's talk it through. Mm-hmm. I'll pick a sentence. The Biden team clearly did not seek this war. That part of the sentence I agree with. In fact, they made a strenuous and very public diplomatic effort to avert it. That I don't see. They allowed, to me, and let me kind of give some context for that. Zelensky was elected on a platform of negotiating with Russia, a platform of peace, potentially including ceding territory. When he first asked for help after this brutal invasion began, he had two main points he wanted support on, that he wanted weapons and he wanted help negotiating. It seems to me that in the run-up to this invasion, the Biden administration did extremely little to, and I'm not saying there's any legitimate fear that would legitimize this invasion, but they did very little. The discussion of Ukrainian NATO membership was still out there. I mean, I know there were some demurrals, but, it was very much still alive. I'm not aware of any public efforts to try to convince the Russians not to invade. Not that I'm not even sure that would have mattered. I doubt it would, but I didn't see a very public diplomatic effort to avert it. When the invasion happened, we saw, after about a month, Zelensky stopped talking about negotiations. But, this is a guy who backed off that position originally because the, fascist right in his country threatened his life, as I understand it. And he would be hard put to negotiate a peace after the invasion unless the United States did. Instead, the United States imposed a set of sanctions against Russia that to me would be the only basis for a negotiated settlement, but won't participate in the negotiation process directly. They say that's between Ukraine and Russia. So I don't see either before the invasion and meanwhile, we have Biden's slip saying Putin's got to go. We have the Secretary of Defense talking about, hoping this war weakens Russia militarily. Mm-hmm. You get what I'm saying, right?
I get what you're saying. No, yeah. So let me just respond to that a little. I mean, first, when I'm talking about the efforts leading up to February 24, I think you did see a number of pretty high-level U.S. officials, particularly CIA Director Bill Burns, making trips to Moscow, having communications with the Russian leadership. And I think, Bill Burns, people who are familiar with him, he is, one of, if not the most capable diplomat in the U.S. government. He's essentially become like, the special presidential envoy for all the difficult stuff. When you need someone to go and kind of, have these discussions, Burns is someone the president will send. And so this was, I believe, late last year in December, talking to the Russian government and making clear that we did not want, we saw what was happening because they had begun massing troops, if you remember, on the three sides of Ukraine as beginning in early as March of 2021, a year before the invasion eventually happened. So in addition to that, as I mentioned in the piece, you also had visits by French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz, in person with Putin sitting around that big table in weeks before the invasion. And both of them came out of those meetings when they spoke to the press and made clear and specifically mentioned the issue of Ukraine and NATO. Now, did they come out and say Ukraine will not join NATO? They didn't. But they clearly said that, these issues were under discussion in a way that I think in terms of, how diplomacy tends to work, that efforts were being made to address what Putin had, presented as Russia's security concerns and grievances. Also to this, I would just add, this issue of Ukraine and NATO, it is a problem. As I said, there's evidence. It's not something that Putin just made up. It's something that is a real concern for Russia going back to the 90s. But the fact of the matter is, as long as part of Russia part of Ukraine was occupied, as it was going back to 2014, there is no chance that Ukraine would ever join NATO because, part of joining, one of the requirements for joining NATO is making sure that there are no existing border disputes for your country. So as long as parts of Ukraine were occupied by Russian forces, as they were beginning in 2014, Putin already had essentially created for himself a veto over Ukrainian NATO membership. And I would just add here, while it is, it's a fair, but, we'll never really know if more promises and clearer commitments on NATO might have averted the invasion. I tend to think it would not. It is very difficult to see, especially when you look at what Putin himself said in his speech on the eve of the invasion and the piece that he published over a year before about his vision and his broader set of grievances and concerns and goals for this kind of new Russian imperium, or whatever term one wants to use. This is far bigger than just having to do with NATO. Now, did NATO contribute to these concerns and these grievances? Absolutely. I'm not denying that. That is an entirely legitimate point to make. We should not forget it. But I also think it's wrong to focus on NATO expansion as kind of this single explanatory factor for how we got here.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, I think Putin has grandiose ideas for sure. But, I would only say that visits from France and Germany, I'm sure Putin sees NATO as an American instrument. And right. The fact that the U.S. didn't do that. But you're right. That's a parenthetical point to a certain extent. I guess the other thing, Matt, if you've got another minute, that keeps sticking in my mind about this is the charges of hypocrisy. While, if it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do. If it's the wrong thing to do, so be it. But, the fact is, at the same time that we're doing this, the U.S. is holding $7 billion of Afghan money after, conducting, waging war in that country for 20 years. Now Biden wants to give it to, survivors, distributed by a lawyer he knows or something.
Right.
Don't you think that undermines our ability to say we're acting as a moral voice in a place like Ukraine?
It absolutely does. I agree with that 100%. And we could run down a long list of other things that undermine our ability to do that, undermine our credibility. Don't even get me started on, the support we continue to give to undemocratic, authoritarian, and repressive regimes in the Middle East. At the same time, we claim to stand up for human rights and democracy, even considering a presidential trip to Saudi Arabia, for example, in the hope that they'll turn the crank and pump more oil. All of this undermines America's moral voice and our claims to support human rights. And again, this is what I was just saying before. I think we have to continue to press on those issues. But my voice is, my argument is basically, we can try to get Ukraine right, as I see it. And again, I think there's space for disagreement about what getting it right means. What's the right policy and what are the right tools to help the Ukrainians, while at the same time continuing to try and transform and demilitarize our overall foreign policy.
Right. No, I think that's the goal. And my biggest fear, and by the way, I'll also say, if we ever try again to get $25 billion to vaccinate the world from COVID that's killed 1 million Americans, people are going to say, we don't have the money after having just written a check for $40 billion, right?
Right.
So, but to me, and maybe we can close on this, to me, you put your finger on it, Matt. My biggest concern, which is, obviously my biggest concern is for the lives of the Ukrainian people and all of us, but the fact I see this playing out where the same people who are so wrong about Iraq, so wrong about Afghanistan, so wrong about Libya and Syria are on TV every night. It seems like publicly and privately, the military-industrial complex and its agents, or leaders or whatever you want to call them, who have been rightfully discredited by history, are suddenly riding high. And my fear is, obviously, I want to do what's right for the Ukrainian people, but if we do that in a way that makes them more powerful will all, plus the threat of nuclear war with Russia, which we haven't even touched on, that if we're not conducting policy that minimizes their power, if we're not conducting policy in a way that focused on negotiations to end the killing in Ukraine and avert the threat of nuclear catastrophe, then really it'll be a Pyrrhic victory at best to provide. Do you get what I'm saying?
I get exactly what you're saying, and I agree with it totally. I mean, I think, yes, that is, part of my concern. Again, I get at this in the piece, is the way that the Ukraine war has essentially provided a new mission in life for, the foreign policy establishment, which is trying to kind of rehabilitate itself around this new grandiose vision. And I think that is incredibly dangerous. So again, I think the challenge here is to try and get our policy on Ukraine right, while at the same time pushing back, pushing for some accountability from all these folks who've gotten it so wrong for so long, and continue to try to transform our foreign policy approach in general. It's a tough one, but I think that's the job.
Well, I will say in conclusion, Matt Duss, that we don't agree on everything. We didn't when we started, we don't now, but we agree on a lot. And most of all, we're talking. And it would be kind of ironic if we were, all of us were arguing for negotiations abroad and aren't talking to each other at home. So I'm really glad we had this conversation. I'm really glad we found so many points of agreement. And I really thank you, Matt Duss, for agreeing to come on the program and talk about this with me. Thanks for inviting me. It was a great pleasure. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.